China and Japan, very much the region, of course, that's of concern to Australia. And these stories about, well, a kind of growing confrontation, it seems, the United States, Japan, China over these islands. What do you make of it?
Well, Roger, I think that in all of these things, as we've seen throughout history, the big risk is that of a miscalculation that could turn, I guess, diplomatic sabre rattling into something a bit scary or a whole lot scarier. And we know how easy it is for other incidents to occur where things cross the line from diplomatic tensions into military escalations, as your guest said earlier. Is a bit like a street fight. Who's going to take the next punch or up the ante on this? So we've seen reckless activity in the past as well that has turned into deeper tensions that go somewhere else. So let's hope that this is just a diplomatic issue and that it doesn't turn into something much more serious.
The Australian government taking this on board at the moment and looking at it?
Well, certainly, yes. Australia's Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, actually called in the Chinese ambassador during the week to not carpet him, but to express concerns about what is happening in China and to say that this is not useful for anyone. And obviously it's important for Australia, given that China is one of our major trading partners. The Chinese didn't take all this,
according to the press release,
that well, and
Julie Bishop told him it was irresponsible.
Bishop's comments in criticising the Chinese action on this zone was irresponsible and mistaken, and the Chinese Foreign Ministry has expressed its strong dissatisfaction, asking Australia to immediately correct what it's calling a mistake. So the diplomatic cables and tensions really are flying, Roger.
And what about Australian aircraft? I mean, I don't know if they do fly that area, but are they likely to ask permission, which is what the Chinese say they have to, or what's the policy?
I think that Australian Airlines, I don't know, Roger, whether they actually do fly within that area. I would imagine that the advice from the Australian government would be to be in line with our chief ally, the United States, but at the same time to be charting a middle course on this and keeping the language diplomatic. But it really does raise a whole new confusing area about what this means and what does it mean for commercial aircraft. How do they react if they get messages from the Chinese? What happens if they are buzzed by Chinese fighter jets? This is where the risks of a miscalculation really come to the fore.
It does seem like it's going to be very complicated. But let's also have a look at something where I think the diplomatic difficulties are probably a little way off yet, but they may well come, which is to do with what's going on with Qatar as it moves towards the 2022 World.
Well, all due respects to the World Cup in Qatar, I'd rather pay a little bit more attention to this East China Sea business and Australia's role in generating the controversy or generating the conflict. Okay, here you can see China, Taiwan, or the rebel province of Formosa according to the Chinese. You can see South Korea and North Korea, and you can see Japan. And it's fairly normal for nations with a sea coast to declare a 200-mile territorial economic limit for fishing and mining and prospecting and pleasure boating or whatever. It's also fairly normal to proclaim a 200-mile air defence identification zone off the coast of sovereign nations or off the borders of sovereign nations. And in a situation where you haven't got 400 miles of spare geography, you draw the border along the middle and you sort of hope. Now, the very southern end of Japan is the Ryukyu chain. So if you go 200 miles west of the Ryukyus, there's probably a couple of rocks out there that the Japanese reckon are their rocks. And the Chinese have just declared an air defence identification zone, reaching out over the top of the rocks the Japanese like to think of as being Japanese rocks. And if you did want to fly from South Korea or Japan on the direct route to Taiwan or the Philippines, then yeah, you would be overflying what the Japanese call Japanese territory and what the Chinese call Chinese territory. And if you wanted to be stubborn and bloody-minded about it, and you really didn't want to be friendly with your next-door neighbour just because they were vastly bigger than you, then you might dig your heels in and refuse to contact air traffic control before you take off and file a flight plan, or talk to them on the radio. So, China announces an ADIZ, Air Defence Identification Zone, and for some reason, China declaring an Air Defence Identification Zone irritated the underpants of the people in Washington, so therefore the excited states invoked a telephone call under the ANZUS arrangement. A for Australia, NZ for Kiwi land, US for Norte Armed Americano, the Yankees. And according to ANZUS, if any one of the three signatories were ever to be attacked by anybody else, and at the time they thought it would be the Russians, the United Soviet Socialist Republics, the idea was that the other two powers would come to their aid. So, Washington gets cranky at the Chinese daring to declare an ADIZ, even though if you were to try and fly eastwards across that 200-mile nautical limit boundary outside the American beach, you would be contacted by radio, and if you didn't answer you would be intercepted, and if you didn't do what you were told you would be shot down as a potential terrorist in the war against terror. So, the Australian Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, calls in the Chinese ambassador and tells the Chinese ambassador that this announcement of an air defence identification zone is unacceptable and irresponsible because it threatens to disturb the status quo ante of military power within the region. And, as it has been pointed out, no Australian jets fly in that area. So it's pretty obvious that Australia is doing the poodle dog dance, you know. America says jump and we ask how high after all feet are off the ground. Yep, 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 yep. Just like we went to Afghanistan and we went to Iraq twice before the Americans had asked us to go, and we went to Vietnam before the Americans asked us to go, and we went to Korea. Like, Australia cements the solidity of the ANZUS alliance by doing America's bidding on a diplomatic front and then rushing in with troops to be seen to be there. The coalition of the willing example. None of which amused the officials in Beijing, especially as our government's been claiming that they were going to sign a free trade agreement with China within, 6 months, or maybe it was by Christmas. The whole idea being that China is Australia's most important trading ally, or trading partner. So, yeah, the Australian Consul General got called into the Peking Foreign Affairs Ministry and told that it was completely unacceptable for Australia to voice such a ridiculous opinion on such a matter. And about that time, after Japan and South Korea had already flown unarmed civilian airliners through the Air Defence Identification Zone without filing a flight plan, without contacting Chinese air traffic control, after Bronwyn started playing tit-for-tat between Canberra and Beijing, that's when the Yankees took off a couple of 8-engined jet bombers, the B-52s, from Guam, and flew them up to Japan and down through the ADIZ and back. And that wasn't considered to be provocative or irresponsible, because the bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons were considered to be unarmed, or reported as being unarmed. So the Chinese announced that they've put fighters and airborne early warning command and control aircraft into the area. So the South Koreans and the Japanese have been flying their military aircraft through the area without a flight plan. So it makes one wonder, what for, how come and why did the Australian government in Canberra think it was a clever idea to get itself involved in a borderline shit fight on the East China Sea when our aircraft don't go there? Well, I suggest to you The idea was to draw public attention away from the foreign relations international policy disaster that we've been conducting for the previous fortnight or 3 weeks with our biggest, nearest northern neighbour, Indonesia. Now, Australia's problems with Indonesia pretty much started when Tony Abbott was elected, because he'd said some fairly provocative things during his election campaign, including the idea that he was going to station Australian intelligence operatives in Indonesia who were going to collect information regarding the imminent departure of boatloads of refugees who tend to use Indonesia as a stepping stone on the way to Australia. And Tony Abbott was elected on the platform of stopping the boats, and he said he was going to buy the boats and he was going to spy on the boats, and the Indonesians said to him, look, no, you can't do that. So he went over there on a kowtowing, bowing and apology tour, and he said, well, look, how about this? How about we give you the money that we would have spent spying on the boats and buying the boats, and you can spend it stopping the boats and putting people into the detention camps. And in return, Australia will never, ever, ever again withhold its supply of live cattle exports to Indonesia, because we know how much it offended you when the previous government stopped sending cattle to be beaten to death and bludgeoned and chopped up with machetes. And the Indonesians said, yeah, okay, fair enough. And also, Tony Abbott sweetened the pot by offering to sell 200 million acres of northern Australia to the Indonesians so that they could run it as a cattle farm and tell their own population that they weren't importing Australian cattle, they were importing Indonesian cattle. So, things were looking pretty good until The Guardian announced that Edward Snowden's information leak on the American NSA had suggested that Australian secret squirrels were monitoring high-ranking telephones in Indonesia out of the Australian embassy. The Indonesians got upset with it. 3 weeks ago they started grumbling, and the Australian government demurred. Oh, we don't confirm or deny anything to do with intelligence matters. And the Indonesians said, this has got nothing to do with intelligence matters, it's just bloody rude. You people want us to be friends, you say you're friends and you treat us like shit. Oh yes, but it's security, secret national security. So then it transpired that the particular phones that the Australian secret squirrels were tapping was the Indonesian president, the Indonesian president's wife, and 8 of the top ministers in the parliament. The Indonesians got really cranky and they said, this is rude, we demand an apology and an assurance that it won't happen again. And Julie Bishop, and then Tony Abbott, and then Julie Bishop, and then Tony Abbott, and then Julie Bishop kept on saying, oh no, we don't confirm or deny, we don't confirm or deny, and security, national security. And Tony Abbott made a speech in the floor of Parliament where he said that he regretted that the Indonesians were embarrassed, but he wasn't going to confirm or deny and he couldn't apologise because that would be tantamount to a confession. So the Indonesians wrote to Australia and said, look, you must give us an undertaking somewhat similar to the one that Obama gave to the Germans when he said, this didn't happen on my watch, it was a mistake, it's not happening now and it won't happen again. And once again, can't confirm, can't deny. Australia stated that we should not be expected to apologise for anything that was done in maintaining Australia's national security interests. So, for some reason, Tony Abbott wants to back the judgment of whatever ratbag secret squirrel decided that it was in Australia's interests to know what time Madam President was having a hairdressing appointment, because nobody has used mobile phones for anything more important than inter-family communications ever since it was recognised that it's a radio set and it can be intercepted and listened to. So, the Indonesians broke off all military and intelligence cooperation with Australians, including all efforts to hinder refugees who were let out of the detention centres in Indonesia. The Indonesians announced that their government-owned corporations were no longer going to sign any new contracts to buy Australian cattle or wheat, and the Indonesians have held a commission into the Australian response to the demand for apology, and they've stated that it was substandard, lacking, and it's a pity they didn't say they were sorry. and the Indonesian estimate is it might take about 3 years or so to repair relations between the two nations. But that would be if the self-centred white supremacist racist rednecks in Canberra come to their senses and recognise that Indonesia buys 10 times more than it sells Australia, and it sells to Australia. They can do without us. We can't really do without them in terms of our cattle and our wheat export ambitions. And apparently, therefore, thus and because, the Australian government decided that having irritated and offended 215 million Indonesians and got them offside, the way to draw Australian redneck public opinion away from that would be to preempt the Americans and the Japanese and the South Koreans and the Taiwanese and pick a shit fight with China, our biggest trading partner. Rue Abbottania, pride goeth before a fall. 5 Chinese crackers up your arsehole, bang, 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 bang. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Would that it were not true. Our government is cruising us for a bruising. Ciao.